Thank you. And looking at that screen, I've been on campus 4 out of 5 days this week. Those of you who've been here know that the view, if you turn around on this beautiful colored spot there, which was designed and put in by one of our own employees, Michelle, thank you. We have some fabulous views, and we're based in a beautiful part of the city. And as always, SAIT likes to take a moment. It's important to the three of us as well to recognize that we are situated on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So today that includes our Indigenous people of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Northwest Métis homeland. SAIT also acknowledges all of the people who make their homes in Treaty 7. Alberta covers 6, 7, and 8, and we know that we've people joining us from right the way across Canada and sometimes even further into global stretches. So wherever you're coming to us today, thank you for taking a moment just to recognize the land that you're connected to. For us here, it's a place where we walk, learn, play in the footsteps of our Métis people. Thanks, Doug. And Craig.
All right, thanks, Jenny. And again, for the folks that have rolled in here as we've gotten going, feel free to use the chat to carry on the conversation. If you have any specific questions, please try and put those into the Q&A portion. Makes it much easier to moderate. But I want to take a moment and introduce a new face on the screen this morning, and that is Doug Juner. Doug is the Managing Director of 4Rev and has helped a number of organizations with digital transformation. And we've been fortunate enough to work with Doug here at SAIT to stand up some of our content and programming specifically related to digital transformation, digital leadership, and we're just excited to have Doug join the conversation today. I think it's an opportunity for me to moderate a bit more than participate, which is maybe a relief to some of you. You know, right off the bat, we're here to talk about digital intelligence this morning. And so this is one of the 6 intelligences that we've identified. Seems a little bit different perhaps than psychological safety, social intelligence, emotional intelligence. This one maybe, is it tech? Is it not tech? I think that's a great place for us to start today is, Doug, what the heck is digital intelligence? And Jenny, feel free to add your perspective here.
I'll let Doug speak.
Thanks, Greg.
There you go.
Thanks, Greg. You know, interestingly enough, I think for those of you that know me, I'm not a big fan of the term digital transformation because I think, quite frankly, it puts too much of the focus on the technology and not enough focus on the people and the culture and the sort of the organization itself type of things. We were jokingly talking before about the difference between digital leadership and analog leadership. And, you know, I guess the best example I can give of that is I think that in this new world of digitization, some of the things that as leaders we've sort of taken for granted have changed. And one of the ones that Jenny and I were talking about in preparation for this is a discussion around boundaries. And, you know, as an example, we'll call it the analog environment where it's paper-based. With all the COVID stuff that's ongoing and has gone on, is things such as in a physical environment, it's the end of the day. Craig, I need you to follow up on some work for me. It's 7 o'clock at night. I happen to be working late because it works for my schedule. And I drop a file folder on your desk. It's implied that you're not going to look at that till tomorrow morning. In today's world where we're all connected digitally, 7 o'clock at night happens to work for me. I send you an email. Do I expect a response? And one of the things, you know, this connected all the time. And I think in the paper world, nobody discussed it. The boundaries weren't discussed that, well, if a file folder shows up on your desk at 7 o'clock at night, I think that's one of the things that leaders need to have those conversations now. And, you know, when I send you an email, I don't expect a response until such time. Or, you know, my team knows from my perspective that if someone sends me a text message, that's kind of like, I need you to respond as soon as possible. If it's email, it's regular business hours. And I think that as leaders, we should be having these discussions that in the past were just sort of simply implied.
It's really cool that you said that sort of straight off the bat. I was chatting with, I think it was last week, some people, and we were talking about exactly that. And one of the leaders in the room, virtual room actually, said email is work. And so he said, I turn my email off at the end of the day. If my team need me, they will text me or they will phone me. And so I like the way that we've put that in. And one of the pieces that I think is getting forgotten here as we look virtually is we have to change the defines of how we work. So that, is that sort of digital well-being piece, as well as what are we looking for in terms of performance? Because when we were face-to-face, you had a time piece, and that really, we rated you on that. Did you show up to work and did you do your work? And now it's really, are you doing your work and are you doing your work with quality, which is an opportunity when we think about it that way, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think there's a good discussion that we had back at the beginning of COVID is I think a lot of organizations measured performance by work presence, not work product. And, I know of organizations that I've been inside of where it was more important that somebody was sitting at their desk than they were remote and getting work done. And, the measurement, a lot of this stuff is implied. And that's where I think that as leaders, we need to take it upon ourselves to have more of those conversations and to make sure that, people understand what the boundaries are. And that's one of the things that I think is a huge switch, is, taking a step back, and this has nothing to do with digital, is I also think that organizations undervalue leadership as a skill. And it's sort of implied that the best developer should be the boss of the developers, or the best ditch digger should be the boss of the ditch digger. It's a totally different skill set. And so this conversation around boundaries is, I think that's not an easy conversation for someone to necessarily have if they don't have strong leadership skills. And so I think that's something that, to keep in mind as well, is that it's a new, it's part of the new environment that leaders need to, take ownership of.
100%. What I found interesting through this period is, so I spent 17 years in pharmaceutical medical device before I came here. 15 of those 17 years was working remotely already, right? I started off, basically, it was my windshield, was my office. And this transition back, not an issue from my perspective, but you realize quickly how people who never worked in a remote environment and weren't used to asynchronous communication and weren't used to leveraging digital tools to collaborate and communicate, that was a struggle. It was huge. Brent has an interesting comment in here with respect to asynchronous communication, and that's a lot of what we're seeing now, right? We've got pending legislation in Ontario for off hours, similar to the France legislation. So the question is really, butts in seat are no longer the measure, is it?
And when we say that out loud, how do we actually get to that point? Like, when you think about it, this is a job that we have to do, this is a work we have to do, and we're talking about performance and quality. How did we ever get to that point where butts in seats was a measure? So it's a good thing, really. Like, that's one of the pieces that comes from this, through all the challenge and figuring it out. It's a good thing, because now we can look at performance and we can look at quality. And
right.
If somebody does that in a shorter time, but they are reaching the level that has been set, or the bar that is understood between all of you, there's another difficult conversation. What does quality look like? What does performance look like? The prime example, I'm going to have some great people join me here today. I can talk till 5 o'clock. You both know that. But how long will I actually give them quality and value for? What's that delivery piece? What's the part within there? I think that's a fabulous conversation for us to, not here, but for teams to look at and start to dig into. And Doug, I think you had a real point too, in terms of these are difficult conversations, and not every leader is equipped to deal with those conversations, especially if you've just come up straight through that stream. You were good at your job, now be good at people. And that's a big piece that we know sits underneath all this, the digital excitement that's out there.
Yeah, and I see, like, Dana put a comment in here about organizations expecting always be available. I don't think that's realistic. And, you know, I think one of the terms that I think is changing is the whole work-life balance versus work-life integration. You know, one thing that I believe is I don't think it's a bad thing to enjoy your job. And as a matter of fact, and I think there's a quote from someone famous. I don't know who. My dad always said it to me, but if you enjoy your job, you never work a day in your life. And I think with this constantly being connected, you know, if we take a step back and talk about bums in seats, someone put that in the channel there about it's an easy metric, and it goes back to that lack of leadership skills. It's an easy way to have a metric that's balanced across the board. Everybody's at their desk. That's how I'm going to measure it, as opposed to output. And I'll be honest, I'm guilty of this. Is to, you know, to your point, Craig, I've worked remotely for 25 plus years. You know, as soon as I had a laptop and could connect from the hotel room, I was working remotely. You know, full disclosure, I never gave consideration to sending emails at 10 o'clock at night until COVID hit. And then it was like, you know, the team members are like, well, did you expect me to respond? Or they feel guilty, or that animosity. And I think as a strong leader, that's what we're trying to do away with. And these digital tools have only enabled that, you know, even further.
Yeah. So there's a couple of points here I think I'm going to try and double click on, and that is, you know, Tom has made a good point here. Leadership is a different skill set, and I've often seen good people struggle as leaders because they weren't given the support, coaching, training, etc., to learn the skills of leadership. So specific, I think, to our conversation today, what is digital leadership then? What are those digital skill sets, or what are those leadership skill sets that leaders have to have in a digital age? March 15th, 2020, leadership by walking around the office was there. You can't, you know, March 16th, 2020, that disappeared for a lot of people who were, you know, had to work from home, shelter in place. So what does that leadership skill set look like for a digital leader?
So I think one of the big, when I look at technology, I look at it as having two layers. And the first layer is, you know, what's possible. So I'm just going to throw up a quick screen here, a screenshot of, is I get this question all the time, is that, you know, I don't have deep technical knowledge. So how am I supposed to know what's possible? And it's, you know, I'll use the analogy of driving a car. You know, the majority of the people that drive a car don't understand how it works, and don't need to understand how it works. And I think one of the things that leadership today needs to understand is that we don't need to get into the weeds. What we really want to do, and I love this here about just being curious. And, you know, if you see something in your day-to-day lives, and just think of how many of us, you know, revolve around our smartphones. I think there's this statistic that said the average person uses 9 apps per day in their smartphone. And why do we do it? Well, it makes life convenient. You know, I'm sitting on the couch, I forgot to order something that I need. I open my phone with one click, and, you know, it's on my doorstep the next morning. Why do I do it that way instead of driving to the store? Because it's convenient. Well, why can't we take those ideas and bring them back to our job? And, you know, a lot of people would be, well, I don't know how that works. I don't know. You don't need to. There's lots of smart people that can make it work. And those same smart people don't understand all the problems that are out there. So they don't know to solve it until somebody brings it forward. And I think, you know, a big part of giving your team the opportunity to come up with ideas and talk about what's possible, and without the concern that somebody's going to say, well, that's silly because I don't know, you know, the underlying bits and bytes of it, is, do we create that safe space? I know Jenny talks about psychological safety all the time. And one of the things we're going to talk about is something called a cool-off. And this was one of my clients. Carly had this idea of, she really encourages her teams to come up with cool-offs. And a cool-off is, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? Wouldn't it be cool if we could do that? And, you know, the fact that it's either easy or complicated at a implementation level should be irrelevant. That's for the smart people to figure out. And so I think as leaders, we want to create those environments where people are not afraid to say, hey, I wonder if we can do this.
And so I think there's a really key piece in here. I would put myself, I love it that you talked about cars. It's a running joke in our family that if we talk about cars, mum's only piece is it's blue. And we do have a blue car actually. That's as far as my knowledge on cars goes, full stop. And it's the same on a lot of these tools. And so I like that in terms of, as a leader, you can create the space. Cool if, it would be cool if, in fact, my brain already has gone to 5 things. It'd be cool if we could do this. It'd be cool if we could do that. So one of the key pieces I think that sits underneath here is making space for those conversations. And that's tough when we're running at a high demand, high pressure, high pace piece. And so there's a difference, I think, in thinking and a different in doing. And so that's perhaps one of those underlying leadership skills, is recognizing that in order for us to move forward, we have to stop doing for a bit and create that space to allow people to think and join the dots. And that little kid's face, that curiosity, I feel like if we've talked 15 times, Craig, or 8 times, curiosity's probably come up 2/3 of the time that we're talking about. And it's that pure, what if, rather than, well, that won't work, or we don't have the technology for that. Maybe we do.
Yeah, absolutely. This art of the possible, Doug, I'm wondering if we can dive a little bit deeper on that. Your analogy of the car is a great one, right? You don't need to know how it works. And, I certainly don't even understand the technology in some of these vehicles, like these F1 cars. But when you go back to a car, the art of the possible is where it can take you and what it allows you to do. It's not the vehicle itself. Yeah, sure, Matthew McConaughey may make a Lincoln look pretty cool, but right, what is the art of the possible? And that's, how do you as a leader, if you don't understand the technology, right, or what level do you need to get yourself to understand the blockchain, AI, ML, how important is you that you know all the details? This is, I think, where leaders probably struggle, and it's advanced so quickly over the last 24 months, right? Like even Facebook isn't Facebook anymore. It's gone so quickly. How do you as a leader keep up? And then how do you help your team understand what can be possible?
And I think like one of the things I talk about all the time is demystifying technology. Is I think, and I don't want to point fingers at anybody, but I think certain industries purposely overcomplicate their environment so that it's hard for people to challenge it or to sort of figure out where they fit in the marketplace. And I think there is an opportunity for, I'd like not only leaders, but I think for their teams, is to understand at a super high level just sort of some of the applications. So for example, if anybody's used Google Maps, you've used artificial intelligence, whether you realize it or not. And all artificial intelligence is a computer doing something that normally a human would do. To come up with ideas of how you might use it, you don't need to know any more than that. There are smart people that will that will figure that out. And so that's why I think I think that 2-layer thing is that I think it's quite easy to learn at a super high level, understand what is the difference between, what is edge computing, what is Internet of Things, what are all these things, and put them into layman's terms, as opposed to saying, I need to understand how blockchain works at a developer level. And that's where I think that idea of the cool ifs and the what ifs comes from, is, I don't know how it's done, but wouldn't it be neat if we could do this and leverage this piece of technology? And so when I talk about digital literacy, to me, it's not a 3-week course on blockchain. It's a 15-minute discussion. So people go, oh, okay, I understand. I get what that is at a high level. And how could I potentially apply something like that in the real world?
So so I'm a leader, and technically I don't fit into the smart bracket in terms of technology. And my mum's not on here, so she's not sitting there saying, Jenny, stop it. And so somebody has
I'll say that, Jenny, stop.
Somebody has a really cool if, or a what if, or wouldn't it be brilliant if we could do this? And we've had that yes and conversation, because we're into that collaboration and all the rest of it. What then? Like, where do you go? We keep talking
Yeah.
about smart people. We know we have an IT department, but they're already stretched because Zoom keeps kicking everybody off or Teams isn't working. And the last thing they want is somebody to arrive saying, we think this is really cool. And so what do you do next? Like, what's the
so before I answer that question, I want to go back to something just really, really quick, just to give people sort of an image to put in your mind. You made a good point earlier, Jenny, about making time to think as opposed to do, right? And I kind of had an aha moment on the weekend where I had to do some handyman stuff. But the analogy that I came up with is, think of if you're doing something for the first time, whatever that is, right? And you take the time to think about what is it I'm doing. Yet when you do something for the 100th time, you just do it. And I think that's the rut we get stuck in our processes, is that because we've done it so much, no one stops and says, is there a better way? Right. Could I be doing this differently, right? Because it just becomes mechanical, that I just go through the motions. So, I really like that. And we've had that conversation about the importance of thinking time versus doing time. Now, to answer your question on, where do we go from here? This is where I see what a lot of organizations have done, is they've created silos. And, I'm going to throw up a slide here really quick, that it's not to try and point the finger at anyone, but in terms of, I think where we need to get to is what I call lifting the veil of IT. So, IT has always sort of been this black box where the technology resides in there. And it's not a knock on the IT group. It's what we've done organizationally is that each group is measured individually. The problem that IT has is that if they're measured at an individual level, the downside to IT is they're the expense. The beneficiary is the finance department or the sales department or the marketing department. So what ends up happening is to when finance comes up with a really cool idea about how to streamline a given process, generally what happens is the cost is carried by IT. Right. And if the IT group is measured strictly on the performance of the IT department, it just strictly becomes a cost center. And so, if I'm the IT manager and my bonus is based on me staying within my budget, why would I invest a whole bunch of my money so that another group can realize the benefit from it? And so that's why this has to be at the highest levels of the organization, to say, we don't measure the success or failure of IT based on the budget. We measure the success or failure based on the business outcomes. And that's where I think, to your point earlier, you mentioned, Jenny, about creating an environment for these ideas. That environment has to go across business units. So, when there's a COOLIF in finance, hopefully they can have what I'll call a casual conversation with IT that says, yeah, that's doable, but here's the downside, or here's the risk, or yeah, that's a great idea, right? And again, just because something is possible doesn't mean it's, should be done. But I think what's happened is you don't have the conversation between business units that says, here's my problem, here's my COOLIF, and the other side saying, well, here's the environment I live in, and here's the, my hurdle, or never thought of that. I never knew that was even a problem, right? We've got ways of solving it. What's tended to happen is that, again, back to IT's given a budget, IT's given constraints, they work within those constraints, and then the business units have to fit inside of that. And that's not a knock against the business unit or IT. That's actually a knock against the CEO for saying, let's not have a cross business measurement. Let's have an individual performance measurement, right?
And we're back to performance measurement, and one size does not fit all. And this really needs a serious rethink. We've been here before. But it was really cool in there. And we've spoken, times before when we look at leadership, we've started talking about numbers of these intelligences. Like, digital intelligence to me is it's a different lens to put across it. And on that collaboration side, how simple and yet how effective bringing people from across the different units. And, I wonder how much work is either repeated or waste, or how many brilliant ideas we lose because we don't take that simple step because we don't make time for that conversation. And the chat is tiny on my screen here, but I caught one come past saying, you know, how do we make the time when we're under all that pressure, under that demand? The pace is there. And let's be fair, some businesses, they're almost trying to play catch up after the last 18 months and get their balances back up to a place that they deem to be healthy. Making that time is difficult. And I think we come back to, you know, it's a time investment, and where can we go if we make that time? If we just keep doing, all we're going to do is just keep doing, and then we'll look up and everybody who made that time is easily down the road somewhere and running on a different playbook. At the moment, there still feels like there's no real playbook for this, and I think that's why people are struggling with it. And two, it takes courage. It takes courage to say, no, we're going to take an hour out, and this is what we're going to do with our hour or 15 minutes.
And yeah, and that's why I say it has to come from leadership in terms of you know, and I deferred you, Jenny, in all things leadership from a, you know, individual skill set perspective. But one of the things that I think of is some of the language is so, it feels like semantics in a casual conversation, but when you peel it back, it's really important. So for example, you know, one of the things we talk about in the program at SAIT here is from a leadership level is dedicating time for that thinking.
Yeah.
So it's not like if you get time at the end of the week and all your tasks are done, go ahead and take a few minutes to think. It's no, we're allotting. So I have one client where they spend Wednesday mornings is their thinking time as a team. They share ideas, and no one's expected to deliver anything in that time. It's about sharing. So they've invested in that sharing and created that time for people to do that. And part of the problem is what I hear is leadership will say, so what we need to do is we need to find some efficiencies so that we have that time. But if you're an employee, as soon as you hear efficiencies, what's that code for? Job cuts, right? As opposed to, we need to find opportunities for growth. How do we find opportunities for growth? Jenny, I need you to figure out how you can spend 4 hours a week, you know, to free your time up to focus on growth, as opposed to figure out 4 hours a week of cutting so that, you know, we can do away with some headcount.
Yeah. And there's a piece in there that actually, when we stop, and I think this is an advantage that the last 18 months has given us, is we can control the clock. So we talk about time as this sort of finite thing, and true, in our world it's linear, and we do things within time constraints, but we have to control that clock to provide those opportunities. And we know, and I know this was conversation one, Craig, I do remember this, when we were talking about meetings, we know that 50% of our time spent in meetings is a complete and utter waste of time. So just take that in itself, let alone the time that people spend on irrelevant emails and all that stuff. But if we just took that meeting time and took a really good cleanup and look at that, I would hazard a guess that most teams would be freeing up a good chunk of time in the week where they could do that. And the company that you talked about, I love that Wednesday morning idea, because if we leave it till the end of the week on a Friday afternoon, my mind might not be totally focused in the place where we want it to be. But the morning, if we look at Daniel Pink's research, we are better at those kind of pieces, depending on what we're looking at. So if we want that hard analytical look at it, mornings are great. Possibly for some, the afternoons are better at creative. So that's where this becomes, again, one size doesn't fit all. So with your team, where is a good place? Where can we block that? And then as a leader, your job is to protect that. So somebody else wants to hold a meeting. Do you have the opportunity to say, we'll come, but not on Wednesday between 10 and 12 or whatever that might be?
Yeah, and so this is an interesting one. So there's a couple comments in the chat I want to get to as well, but this whole concept of, you know, if you want to change something, generally you are adding something new into the mix for the most part. As a leader, what are you taking off?
Yeah.
Right. I think a leader always needs to have that in mind. So Doug, you talk about, you know, leaders approach it saying, you know, we need to find efficiencies. For me, I don't think you can look at it that way. Anytime you're thinking of making a change, and let's face it, digital transformation, as cliche as the term may now be, is a change. So if you're going to introduce technology to affect change, to affect your processes, to affect your products. What are you taking off at the bottom of the list to help that out? And how often do leaders, are they afraid to say, okay, we're going to get rid of this? Is it that? Or is it, well, we're going digital, so it means we should be able to do more in the same time? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that one, because for me, adding something without killing something at the bottom, it doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think that's, to try and bring it back to the digital piece is, I think one of the things that we do with new technology is we try and our mindset is to plug it into the existing process. And so it's like, instead of sending that piece of paper, I'm going to send an email, as opposed to taking the time to think about it and saying, now that we've got the ability to have this in electronic fashion, should we change that process that we created 30 years ago? And those conversations, I don't think, take place. So it should be that, to your point, Craig, what we're doing when we automate some of this stuff is that we've done away with 4 hours of filling in paper. And, so one of the things I think that you see in most organizations is the number of times data gets entered into multiple systems manually. And in today's day and age, once I put some information in our organization, let's say the three of us are in an organization, we shouldn't each have to manually enter that kind of information, right? So that's what we should be taking off the plate, is to say that we've automated this now. It's now digital. It's in the organization. Let's share this, as opposed to a piece of paper that by definition is linear. Only one of us can have that piece of paper in front of us at a given time. And so the process was designed that way. We turn it into, what I've seen this all the time, is we turn it into electronic thing, but we still do it in a linear fashion. Why? Well, because that's how we've always done it.
Well, I need to add a piece in here. Sorry, Craig.
No, go ahead.
I think when we're talking about when we add that technology as well, the piece where leaders, and as a leader, you might have to stand up for your team here too. We saw this with Teams, and to a certain degree, we saw it with Zoom as well last year, is here's this brilliant tool, we're good. And it's a bit like email, and very few people are trained or taught or shown how to use that tool. So now we're guessing in the dark. And, the easiest thing is, well, go look it up on Google or look at a quick clip on YouTube. I mean, God bless our children, but they say to me, did you Google it? No, I didn't, but I do need some support. I need some help to show me how to use this piece. Yeah. And I think there's maybe not everybody, some people are just inclined, go find the answer, and that works for them. But as a leader, that's something that we need to be watching for. There was a beautiful example this week where I had a gentleman in our class, and he was a draftsman, and a colleague of his had retired just this year. But right up until the day he retired, he still did all his drafting pen and paper, because he couldn't make that switch to the modeling and everything else now that they do on computer. And I said, how did that work in everything that we've got going on? Was he okay? And he said he was that good that he did make it until he retired. And it was only in the last 6 months where wherever his drawings go to next, and I began to say, actually, we prefer the computer version. And so as a leader, you've really got to watch, where's that digital knowledge of your team? How are they sitting with that? And some are going to need more help than others. And I think somebody popped in there, this is not all plug and play. And that plug and play or not looks really different for each member of your team too.
Absolutely. I think Stephen also made the point here in the chat. I was just checking some of the comments about, how often are you given a new tool, but then not shown how to use it properly?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And as a leader,
yep.
it's imperative that you have to do that. And if you don't know how to do it, you need to stand up and say, I don't know how. IT help me understand, or Doug help me understand, or Google help me understand, right? There's an interesting comment that was a little while back. It was from Ron, just going back to this whole butts and seat management and, perceived control of the workforce. I would suggest it probably started, if we go back to elementary school, what was the first thing we were asked every morning? Are you here or not, right? Attendance, but that's a different thing. Good leadership requires leadership to be able to delegate and trust that folks will do their jobs. So is technology in the past 24 months, this is my question I'm pulling from Ron's comment here. Is technology helping us increase, or has it caused us to decrease our trust of others at work?
It's interesting that comes up, because I had this experience this week. The tools shall remain nameless, so I don't appear to be pointing fingers, but I had to run a 2-day workshop online with a tool that I wasn't that familiar with. And one of the things that kept popping up was saying that that the window's not the main screen on their computer. And I had to ask, what do all these symbols mean? And the thinking behind that is, well, if it's not the main screen, you're not paying attention. And my immediate reaction was that it's interesting, because very rarely when I'm on a webinar or learning is that my main screen, because I'm usually making notes. And so whatever I'm making notes in is my main screen. And so, this goes back to the digital version of bums in seats. Are you looking at the screen that I want you to look at? I don't know what your environment is. So, we joke, I know, Jenny, you're sitting in front of a single computer. Just from our conversations, Craig, I know you're like me, you have 3. Does that mean that I'm not productive because I'm writing notes about the topic that we're talking about? And so I see a lot of these tools that are about, I'll call it command and control, digital oversight, that I think can create all kinds of problems for leadership. The unintended consequences, if you will.
Yeah. Digital oversight. There's an interesting thing. Right?
And
Sorry, Jenny.
Yeah, 2 things, although I see something coming into the chat, so I'll be quick. Command and control, that just reminds me of something that Simon Sinek said. And, leadership used to be, you're in charge of these people. And that's command and control. And nowadays we talk about people in your charge, which is a completely different mindset. And then the other piece that's curious, trust. When we look at trust is broken down into 4 domains. And trust talks about competence, sincerity, reliability, and care. And so when we look at trust through that piece, it's very possible to trust somebody who's not right in front of you, or whose screen isn't in front of you. And we're back to, how many times have we said this? These are adults who've chosen the job that they're in. They want to get paid. And at the end of the day, they're kind of there for your company. So what's the environment that we're creating here? If you distrust me, you're going to get the worst from me. You're going to get every childlike behavior that I own. But if we've built that trust, there's no stopping the possibilities that we can walk into. So I think that's
that goes back to the very beginning of the conversation today, which was measuring productivity versus a bum in a seat. So, I try, I need X done, and I trust that my team's going to get it done. And, if they keep letting me down, obviously, then I have to deal with it in a different fashion. But I should be more worried about the output, as opposed to, how did they do it? Or, did they have the right screen as the main screen while they were working on whatever it is that needed to be worked on, right? And so, I agree that that's really important.
Yeah, and so the couple questions here I want to get to. Doug, I would just encourage you to put your notes right on the screen where you're looking at the camera, so it looks like you're paying attention. But that's a different strategy. Reva had a question earlier on. So if we're not going to measure butts and seats anymore, what are we measuring? And I think you've alluded to productivity, output, but I don't know if either of you have additional thoughts on that. And then I've got one other question here from Jacqueline before we get towards wrapping up.
So just a thought on that, Craig, is I'm aware of an organization that, as they were coming back, we're starting to figure out what it looks like post-COVID, was that individuals that wanted to continue to work remotely had to apply, and it would be done on a case-by-case basis. And then at the bottom, there was a caveat that said only jobs that have a measurable output will be considered. And I thought, as a leader, isn't that embarrassing that you have people in your organization and you have no idea what they do, that they have no output? So, I think it's we collectively have looked at it as a bum in a seat, and that this group of people, a business unit, there's an output eventually, but we don't understand any individual's contribution to that. It should be frightening. Like, to me, that's a huge red flag, right?
Yeah. Interesting. Jenny, any other thoughts on the whole, what do we measure?
We measure performance. What is the performance that you're looking for? And the difficult piece around this is we're so trained. We love numbers. We rate everything right from kindergarten. Do you get an A? Or now they go 1, 2, 3, 4, I think. You know, and it's all measured. If you're not a 4, you're not in the cool club. And we rate everything by a number. And when you stop and think about it, that's all created. It's like, why? And what is it that we actually want to measure? My performance today is on the value and the impact that I give to the audience here. And that's based on conversation. Good luck putting a number on that. You can ask them if they had a good day, and hopefully they'll all say yes. But the actual performance is, what do they take away from here? And so we have to start to look at performance differently. And that's difficult because we're their legacy pieces. We created it way back in the 1900s where it was easy. How many widgets did you get out? Good, we met that number. And yet perhaps we look at it differently, like, you know, okay, sales, Craig, and I struggle to go here, but it's about numbers a lot. It's about the dashboard and it's about the numbers, but the actual performance is, you know, do the clients come back again? Mm-hmm. Do we build those relationships that last? And so I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, but I think it's a phenomenal conversation that's worth engaging in.
Yeah, and Matt makes an interesting comment here, and I totally agree, Matt. You know, measure leading and lagging indicators that your employees suggest, right? They're the ones that know. Yeah, sales, you're right, Jenny. The number is a lagging indicator. You can't change it.
Yeah,
you can change everything that started back here to affect that number at the end.
Absolutely.
Good, really interesting question from Jacqueline, and maybe we'll use that one as the one to lead into our wrap up. But Doug, do you have any strategies for influencing movement away from traditional linear ways of doing things when upper leadership is still saying back to work like before COVID? I like the cool if, but I don't know that we have the psychological safety to go there yet. There's a lot in that question to ask, but
I mean, just briefly, I think that so what I've seen in terms of, I started this off with saying I don't like the term digital transformation. I think of it more as constant innovation, and digital happens to be some enablers that we have at our disposal that maybe we didn't have before. And as much as it would be great to say that, you know, this new way of working has to come from the top, the reality is what I've seen in most organizations is it starts in the middle and it gets pushed up and it gets pushed down. And so one of the things that has to be done is to convince leadership that, you know, change is imminent. And, you know, what I would say, and this is from a CEO that had me talk to their board, said, I need you to scare the hell out of them and then help them understand that there's a way through this. It's not just a bunch of people, you know, fumbling around in the dark. And so typically what, you know, the way to sell up is to try and get some small wins in this new environment of experimentation and thinking and learning, and then take those small wins and convince leadership that it can be done on scale. And that, you know, that to try and flip the switch all at once on an organization is almost impossible. But, you know, if you can start with some small wins, maybe it's even within a business unit, or best case scenario is 2 business units work together and solve something using that process, you know, of shared values and shared outcomes, and then take that to leadership and say, look, we need to start pushing this across the organization to create that psychological safety.
Yeah. Jenny, any kind of closing thought on the psychological safety aspect of that?
It just, you know, every day it becomes more and more imperative that it's the foundation of everything, hand in hand with trust. Somebody's put in here, can you share the 4 elements again? Sincerity, reliability, competence, and care. And so some will say that psychological safety fits under care, but it's a much, much bigger umbrella, and working on it, it's intentional and it has to be every day. And that's what culture is. Small choices every single day from everybody. And so I think we have to recognize that too. As Doug just said, you can't do it overnight.
No, not at all. Well, interesting conversation for sure. Let's wrap up with Doug. I think you've got a couple slides here on a big idea and a couple thoughts.
Yeah, so following the format in terms of, you know, a big idea from the technology piece is that, remember that technology has 2 layers, and that it's what it can do and how it is done. And that you don't know how to fix the car, but you know how to drive the car. And that's what we need to bring to the table. When I think of 2 actions, the first one is making time. And like I mentioned, I have a client that Wednesday mornings is their time for sharing. And one of the things that I think a lot of is just think of the stuff in your everyday life. Anything that's convenient. And again, it doesn't have to be technology related. One of the projects we worked through was we found that the best solution was pick up the phone and call your client and have a 3-minute conversation with them is going to do more than all the technology in the world. But it's create this thing where people can bring ideas in from their personal life and share that with the team. Create an environment for cool-offs. So whether we're using something like Teams or Slack or whatever your tool of choice is, whether it's physical, whether it's virtual, is where people can bring these ideas forward and understand that very few ideas start out as a polished idea. Most ideas start out as a bad idea, and then they get they get polished. And what we want to do is, there's an analogy a friend of mine is into improvisation, and they talk about there's never yes but in improvisation, it's always yes and we want to create this environment where Doug's comfortable throwing his stupid idea out there, and then the team has the opportunity to say, well, what if we did this, and what if we added this, and how, if we kind of did this. And it's interesting, in my experience, I can sit in a meeting and I can tell you the difference generally between a large organization and an entrepreneurial environment, where in a large organization, there's a lot of yes, but yes, we tried that before, or Joe said we can't do it, or this. And in the entrepreneurial space, it's sort of like, we'll cross that hurdle when we get there. It's we can make it work, kind of things. And then just 3 questions to ask yourself is, as we kicked it off, is, are the boundaries clear? Are we having these discussions, or is it just implied? In the paper world, that was quite easy. Do we embrace or discourage new ideas? And, that goes to creating that psychological safety. And, the examples I just gave within a team. And then finally, it's about just the casual conversations between business units that aren't part of a formal discussion. So I have an idea. I have no idea how it's done. Jenny's the technical expert. Is it okay for me to go and have a conversation with Jenny outside the formal meeting structure, just to say, hey, is this even possible? Is this something that we could look at, kind of thing? And I think that, that goes to that comment I made about breaking down the silos type of thing. And I think open discussion is always better than, sort of formal. It's got to follow sort of the chain of command, if you will.
Yeah. Cool. Jenny, any final thoughts?
No, I like it. It's a good conversation. Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, absolutely. Doug, it was great to have you here. Folks, thanks for joining us this morning. I've thrown a link to next week's registration. We're back next week talking about team resilience. And, it should be a fun conversation as well. So have a great morning.
I wish you could keep up to all the stuff in the chat.
I know, it's crazy.
I struggled to focus on one thing, and there looked like there was lots of great comments and stuff in there. So
yeah, really good conversation going in the chat there this morning. Have a great weekend, folks. Hopefully it doesn't snow too much where you are today, and we will see you next week. Take care.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Doug.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Craig.
Thank you.